of multiplicity and marginality. Other feminist interventions work with a reconfigured version of the conference paper. So Jackie Orr's pioneering performance pieces about panic and emotional contagion are also part of my feminist STS heritage, and use an intricate crafting and an intense intricate crafting of a spoken text, as well as referencing the conventions of reenactment and more recently performing alongside visual materials. The second strand of STS, which I'm actually not going to go into in huge detail, but I will reference because it kind of tallies with what Ellen's just said, draws on feminist theories of performativity in order to craft a different kind of politics of method. So Anne-Marie Moll's parallel ethnographic and theoretical accounts about the multiple makings of disease attempt to enact rather than merely describe multiplicity, and that's that move from description to enactment, which I think is that characterises this kind of work, using Judith Butler's ideas about performativity. Moll crafts a new form of STS by calling attention to what she labels our ontological politics. And of course, John Law, working alongside Moll, has also written extensively now about this creation of new method assemblages involving materially innovative methods which go beyond traditional academic texts. According to Law, we should adopt a less exclusive approach to what can or should be made present in method. We should allow materials other than those currently privileged to be recognised as presences. Law, in fact, concludes his book After Method with a list of metaphors that he feels might energise this kind of work. They include gatherings, processes of weaving, spirals, vortices, and so on. Law and Moll are working within a tradition of the actor-network theory, or within actor-network theory, and this tradition has brought to the fore the importance of objects, and in particular how different kinds of objects are produced by different method assemblages. The third kind of work I want to mention as a potential support for the kind of installation that I've been trying to do is the turn to exhibition as a form of output for STS. In 2005, and this is this slide, Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel curated an exhibition called Making Things Public in Germany. For Latour, this exhibition addressed the question, what would an object-oriented democracy look like? And this was enacted through an exhibition in an art gallery. It was STS as an enacted parliament of objects. In the introduction to the catalogue, which is in fact the only book I've seen recently larger than the STS handbook, each object, that's not a bad thing, each object, he says, each object gathers around itself a different assembly of relevant parties. Each object triggers new occasions to passionately differ and dispute. Each object may also offer new ways of achieving closure without having to agree on much else. So exhibition is one way of taking forward STS interests in object-centred sociality and epistemic cultures. Certainly there are parallels in the ways exhibitions and laboratories bring forth epistemic objects. So there are these precedents within STS for ways of knowing, which draw from or are in dialogue with artistic practice. And artists do come to STS and present. I think of presentations by people like Natalie Jeremijenko, who works in between art and STS. But my sense of uncomfortableness, I think, is not about the act of doing it differently. The problem with which I've had to grapple in creating this talk is related to the one that I had when I titled the Trials of Strength work, which is, what are the consequences of speaking about work to the work itself? Although Moll and Law signal a concern for a more generous and materially innovative method and new ways of bringing method into being, they offer no guidance on how to do this. It's not in their remit. So we are left translating innovation back through some kind of textual output. Moll's genius in enacting a multiplicity through her text is by careful crafting of writing and narrative. I don't want to give the impression that they insist on some kind of textual output, but it's difficult to know where to go without returning to a written text, however unconventional, or a spoken enacted performance. Faced with this problem, I am interested in how artists understand the act of talking about their work. One artist who's been particularly vocal on this topic is Susan Hiller, a contemporary artist based in the UK whose work encompasses painting, photography, sculpture and installation. Have the next slide, please. In 1982, Hiller's installation Monument went on show in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It consists of 41 colour photographs, arranged in a stepped cross, as you can see on the wall. The photos depict a group of Edwardian ceramic plaques from a London park, which commemorate the deaths of local heroes who gave their lives to rescue others. Hiller adds only one extra image, sourced from a graffiti in the park that reads, "Strive to be your own hero." Art theorists have heavily theorised this work and have tended to interpret it as a comment on the pathetic immortality guaranteed by such plaques, which tell of the terrible deaths of those who live a social dream to their death. Telltale phrases such as giving up her lifebelt and going down in the sinking ship. Yet, as frequently is the case with her work, Hiller herself prefaced her remarks about the installation with a warning about the perils of interpretation. In a lecture to accompany the exhibition, she said, "I'm still not convinced that what I or any other artist says or writes is all that important, although this is one of the cornerstones of conceptualism, that is, that the artist really knows what the work is about. But I do not really subscribe to the notion that intention or interpretation are, or can ever be, the same. So, in talking to you about my work, I will not be giving the last word, although this seems what many of you wish to hear from me. I know it's the actual work of the artist that matters." Hiller's argument, reworked in many similar lectures, is that speaking and writing can make the viewer passive. Hiller goes so far as to avoid writing except when it is explicitly part of the work. She avoids any kind of speaking which will act, as she puts it, as a preface to the work. She feels that talking about work may give the impression that it is used up or completed. In another lecture, she tells the audience, "If only you could visit my studio or participate in one of my group pieces or see an installation of mine, I'd be fairly confident that something of what I'm about would emerge. But here," she's in a lecture hall, "in the arbitrary circumstance of me standing before you, talking, I'm mainly aware of the vast gap between that and the work. I'm conscious of talking about ideas, me talking, the rest of you silent, responding with minimal gestures, shifts in position, eye movement. None of this has anything to do with how I work." Hiller is particularly interesting to me because she's had to play a very specific role in contemporary art with relation to the act of explanation. As someone who was trained originally with a PhD in anthropology and having conducted fieldwork in Mexico, Guatemala and Belize, Hiller made the transition to making art in the 1970s as a reaction to the distancing she felt was an inevitable condition of doing anthropology in the academy. She left fieldwork to become an artist, quote, "to find a way to be inside of all my activities." Although this was some years before groundbreaking works such as Writing Culture enabled anthropologists to rethink their relationships to the production of anthropological knowledge, she maintains that anthropologists still have to enact a very conventional way of knowing or in order to make successful careers in the academy. As an artist, she didn't talk about her background as an anthropologist. But since knowledge about her previous training has emerged, she's increasingly called upon to talk about her work as if her background enables her to explain with some authority what her work is about. This is of some frustration to her. Reading through her collected interviews, it becomes clear that one of Hiller's battles is constantly trying to rework invitations to speak about her work into opportunities to learn something about her ways of working through talking. So Hiller is instructive because she actively questions the ways in which artists are called to give account of their work. When she gives lectures, Hiller refuses to prepare more than a sketch of linked ideas in advance and forces herself to improvise. She archives her initial page of notes as a material trace of the event that goes alongside the edited transcript of the lecture. Can I have the next slide, please? I found this, which I thought was really interesting. It's an old note of a talk that she gave at my college in the 1980s, and that's her archive of her talk, which goes alongside the transcript. So those are the notes she kept and improvised from. So it's not that Hiller refuses to talk about her work. Rather, in her improvisation, she offers anecdotal and autobiographical thoughts which enact work made as it is made, to use Gertrude Stein's phrase, rather than work that is heavily theorised in advance or prepared work. Her lesson is perhaps that one should do everything possible not to give the impression that the work is complete or shut down through the act of artist talking. Also in her studio work, Hiller thinks of herself as guided by the material qualities of cultural artefacts that she takes as starting points. She explains that she is strict with herself about keeping the guidelines present, what she calls the guidelines present in the materials. Monument seems to have followed on from her initial decision to photograph colourful plaques in an East London park, and it's the properties of the plaques and the photography as mode of representing the colour, the aesthetics of the plaques, which begin the work. So Monument became about a kind of self-representation through art, as well as about the themes evoked by the plaques themselves of death and the social. This brings me back, in closing, to get the work of getting a tail to wag, which prompted this consideration of waggingness, not just in the presence of the tail, actually in the physical presence of the tail, the dog, but throughout the issues of its representation. And returning to the installation, can I have the last slide? Returning to the installation, the representation of the tail on a video loop had to work in relation to all the other objects, spaces and sounds of the lobby downstairs. Some of these I had control over, such as the size of the monitors and the way the tail loop was juxtaposed with the loop of the dog lead. Although I didn't have control of other elements, such as the blue and white chalet scene, which apparently is yellow now in this monitor rendering, on the back wall, or the 5-foot oil portrait, which is for sale for $1,000 Canadian should you want it. These, of course, become part of the installation, whether I like it or not. So elements of this installation, untitled "This is the Beginning of the Presidential Plenary," engaged in a heroic struggle with the aesthetics of the hotel, the conventions of conference going, and also of registration. And the students commented on how many people they had to direct to registration as part of the performance, and they felt that maybe that some were engaging in the game of Cat's Cradle only as a way to discover where registration was. I thought that was quite nice. I had considered how to make this intervention, and one way was through a very personal desire, as I signalled as I began, of having a friendly dog wagging its presence in the rather alienating first few hours of conference going. In connecting dog to lead to human to Cat's Cradle, I wanted to bring some element out of the representational video through a material artefact. Could you just pull one of these off? Thank you. So out into a material artefact. The black cotton, which would be passed between hands rather than being used to connect human and non-human. Thank you. The problem, of course, that many people had was when they took it off, they didn't know where to go next. Of course, what was being brought into being, and the students were at the sharp end of this, was an enactment of STS-ness. And they found that these were textile students from Concordia, and they were absolutely fascinated with who these STS people were, engaging in very particular ways with this cat's cradle game. In Bruno Latour's Making Things Public, there was a video on non-sheepish sheep, in which a woman had tried to make sheep cooperate rather than compete over food, therefore becoming non-sheepish. I kept thinking of the non-sheepish sheep video as I watched the non-STS-ness of the STS participants taking the cat's cradle and sometimes passing it on. Perhaps this small action, the passing on of the cat's cradle, actually stands as a better enactment of ways of knowing than anything I've managed to say. I'd like it to be the tail that wags the dog, but we'll see. Thanks.
Thank you. I wish we had a couple more hours, but we don't. But we do have enough time to hear a brief intervention from Mike Lynch, our next president of 4S. And then I would welcome any of you to stay and talk with us informally about the matters that have been raised here. It seems like a lot's been put on the agenda, and I'm very, very grateful to our speakers. Mike Lynch from Cornell University, who is also struggling with computers.
Okay, I won't keep you much longer. A year or so ago, I won a hotly contested election for 4S president. There were rumors about problems of access to voting technology, and perhaps there were confusing designs of ballots. Fortunately, nobody cared to contest the election, and so you'll be stuck with me for a couple of years starting at the end of these meetings. When I reflect on the office and its responsibilities, I like to take some of the weight off my shoulders by figuring that it is equivalent to being elected mayor of a village of some 1,500 people. An aptly named example of a place of that size is Victor City, Idaho. I've never been there. I just searched the web and there it popped up. It's near this town of Moose. Now, this might seem a very strange comparison with the 4S. I would venture to guess that the mayor of Victor City, or as it calls itself on its website, City of Victor, Mayor Thompson, by the way, has a budget at its disposal that is many times larger than the 4S budget. Moreover, I imagine the city mayor is much busier than I will be with council meetings, policing the agora, managing local projects and weathering crises, and so forth. Moreover, many citizens of Victor City live there full time, whereas 4S members show at these meetings once a year or sometimes less, and participate sporadically in a few other activities. So comparatively speaking, one might think that I can look forward to a less demanding and less consequential job than Mayor Thompson. Now, if, like me, you feel disconcerted by this comparison, the question is, why do we feel that way? Given the fact that 4S and Victor City are about the same size in terms of the census of its members, and of course the budget thing, I would guess that many of us would say that while size matters for some things, scale is what matters in this context. To borrow for the moment the idioms of actor network theory, 4S aspires to be a macro actor that disseminates its texts and virtual presences through an ever-expanding network. The expectation is that the publication networks in which 4S is enmeshed can amplify the global significance of its collective activities well beyond our limited numbers and budget. But then measures of publication impact indicate that articles in our major journals get cited on average about once or twice a year, and many of the citations are generated from within those same journals. Nevertheless, there is the expectation, and it is not unreasonable, that STS can and should have, and to an extent already has had, pervasive impact on views of science disseminated in legislative and regulatory contexts, popular social movements, public education, and many other places. As many of you should have noticed, there is much talk at these meetings, as well as other recent meetings, about public engagement with science, technology, and medicine. Next one. Okay, there we go. To simplify, there are two rather different, perhaps even incommensurable, visions of political engagement in STS. One vision is that STS research should be a basis for well-informed advice, criticism, and interventions that engage with the concerns of our day: global climate change, stem cell research, pharmaceutical testing and marketing, the production and regulation of hazardous substances, etc. This engagement, grounded in special expertise about science, society, culture, and politics, often counsels skepticism in our circles about seemingly unassailable objective claims. Based on many case histories, the lesson from recent STS appears to be that if skepticism is warranted even in the hardest of cases, it surely is warranted in cases that involve complex hybrids of socio-technical activity in which multiple agencies put forward claims and counterclaims about the facts of the matter. One huge confusion that often arises from the tendency in this field to counsel skepticism, or relativism if you like, about the certainties and efficacies associated with science and technology is that STS advocates skepticism rather than, say, studies what my colleague Steve Hillgardner recently called the social distribution of skepticism. Jokingly, he suggested that STS should incorporate under the trademark of skeptonics, and I promised to get the 4S Council started immediately with drawing up a business model. We could then sell our services to anyone who needed expert advice on how to break down seemingly unassailable claims about certain scientific facts or one best way technology. Next one. Can people read the script of this cartoon? No? Okay. I can't read it from here. I'll give you the gist of it. This is a Doonesbury cartoon from about a year ago. There's a kid working on a calculator. He gets frustrated, throws it in the waste bin, and complains that it's not coming out the way he wants it to, this problem, right? And then in walks this guy with a white coat. He's Dr. Nathan Null, science advisor for the White House, and he advises him that if it doesn't come out the way he likes, that's okay. He can use situational science to make things right, to get the science and math problems to come out the way his beliefs dictate they should. And then there's a list of the kinds of problems, intelligent design and stem cell research and global climate change that Dr. Nathan Null counsels that with the right form of situational science, you can get it to come out the way your beliefs would say they should. It's funnier than that in the way it's written, but that's the gist of it. Now, if it were the case that assertions of certainty were tools of a powerful establishment that mobilizes expertise, black boxes uncertainty, or selectively releases evidence supporting its interests, then skeptonics, trademark, would be a valuable political tool for redressing the imbalance in the playing field and empowering constituencies that are less able to mobilize and disseminate facts. The problem is that it is becoming painfully obvious that skepticism and notions of what Trudeau in this cartoon dubs situational science are themselves useful and usable as powerful tools to resist radical and even incremental changes in public deployments of technology. Moreover, expressions of certainty and assertions that there is strong consensus among relevant experts are used to argue that apparent skepticism about Darwinian theory, the effects of secondhand smoke, the association between fossil fuel burning and global climate change, etc., is constructed in the familiar pernicious sense of the word by politically motivated but scientifically marginal characters. Next one. Not long after the science wars fizzled out, some of the former critics of STS found a more significant target, and that was Bush administration science policy advisors and moles in the White House who did things like doctor texts to put in what Latour and Woolgar called modalities to weaken claims about climate science and so forth. And this is an excerpt from a report that was systematically modified to weaken claims rhetorically. And of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a supportive network of privately funded sound science think tanks and media supporters and hidden moles who doctor science advice by doing this sort of thing. And this suggests they suggest a greater degree of uncertainty and controversy about the facts than the scientific advisory panels are willing to acknowledge. Now, the expertise of skeptonics, like that of intellectual property lawyers, it would seem, would be an apt ally for the powerful as much as for those who impose their agendas. Next one. One vivid demonstration of the lesson that there is no intrinsic relationship between skepticism about establishment science and political critique of the sort that most people in STS would want to promote was Steve Fuller's participation in the Dover, Pennsylvania trial in 2005, Kitzmiller versus Dover School Board, in which he appeared as an expert witness for the defense, who were proponents of exposing students in public schools to intelligent design as an alternative theory to evolution by natural selection. Even after the intelligent design side lost its case, Fuller argued that his appearance represented something of a watershed for STS. Whether or not it did, his appearance was disconcerting for many of us who would be reluctant to aid the cause of Christian conservatives. Though not a proponent of fundamentalist doctrines, Fuller took principled objective to the version of science and evolutionary theory promoted by the establishment organizations that weighed in on the side of the plaintiffs, teaching about evolution. As often is the case in such controversies, the establishment version demarcated science from non-science on the basis of a familiar and often criticized picture of positive science. Regardless of what one might think of the wisdom of Fuller's intervention, it vividly demonstrated that the political implications of anti-positivistic social epistemology can vary markedly depending on the circumstances of the argument. Next one. Another vision of political engagement is less evident, but arguably more deeply connected with the distinctive history of work in STS. This is the view that scientific research changes the world not through expert advice, but by identifying, domesticating, and denaturing novel entities that insinuate themselves as agents into ongoing social and material relations. Louis Pasteur is the prototype in Latour's story, and the Latour there is the Latour Park Doings chapter in the new handbook, which I hope you've all bought by now. Pasteur is the prototype. His new agent, the microbe, becomes a key mediator in a pervasive network of relationships that implicate public health, sexuality, food production, and consumption. His laboratory raises the world, in Latour's terms, as it colonizes, domesticates, disciplines, and denatures the laboratory organisms, while doing so, colonizes, domesticates, and disciplines orders of human activity. Life changes ubiquitously when a new agent, the denatured microbe, joins us at the clinic, the farm, and the dinner table. Pasteur changes the world, but unlike his contemporaries in the vanguard of world socialist movements, his political efficacy works quietly and pervasively, and often with surprising reversals. Okay, the next one. Okay. We can think of other examples of domestication and denaturing if we quickly ransack history of science. Thomas P. Morgan's domesticated Drosophila, the Jackson Lab's standardized mouse, and even the domestication of DNA reproduction through the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. Darwin produced a variant of this as he renatured domestication by placing it within the operations of nature itself through his analogy between natural and artificial selection and the example of pigeon breeding. The social sciences have a long history of emulating the natural sciences, and some of us might aspire for a meta-expertise, never met one that I liked, that would allow us to play the expert in the public sphere, or administer the sciences and domesticate their relations to society. Foucault's great insight, however, was to show how the administrative disciplines precede and furnish the data for the social sciences by domesticating and disciplining bodies and their practices. Indeed, the new science war indicates that the natural sciences are already being domesticated and denatured. Some are struggling to assert their independence, to resist being tamed by administration. Next slide. Now, I'd say that STS has another aspiration and achievement than to follow Pasteur's footsteps, and that is to use history and ethnography to identify and describe the surplus nature that results or spills over the work of domestication and discipline. The program is not anti-naturalistic, showing that all nature is constructed, but hyper-naturalistic, showing how construction remains incomplete and overwhelmed, meeting resistance at every turn. Scientists know this very well, but they don't always make a point of it in public. In the new science war, we may seem to be faced with a stark choice between defenses of an autonomous and objective science that never existed and surreptitious efforts to turn it into a tool for short-term corporate and political objectives. Consequently, we might retreat from the field and live quietly like the residents of Victor City, giving up the dream of efficacy beyond our limited numbers and budget. However, another option might be available, which would allow us to defend the sciences in our own way. Instead of stressing the construction of science and lending our hand to those who would reconstruct or deconstruct it, we can point to how construction is incomplete, how efforts to domesticate the sciences are occasionally resisted and even thwarted by surprising turns. This would not point to a pure nature that precedes construction, but to an unknown nature that remains out of control and perhaps worth preserving. Thank you.
So I think at this point, our next formal event is the business meeting, which you will all attend, where we will be presenting administrative indicators of the success of the organization. But for now, you're also welcome to stay and talk with us until we have to go to that meeting. Thank you all for wonderful talks.
Who's it? Oops. Okay. Okay.
Nice.
This is our last function
This is
together.
it. Oh,
Yeah,
No,
we
it's
had a
not.
good time.
We had a good time.
We did.
Last 2 years have been very interesting.
Yeah, you need adversity. Sorry. Okay. We got to start. Sorry. We would like you to continue to eat and drink and everything else, and you need not be too quiet, only quiet enough to hear Lee Starr, the Master of Ceremonies and President of 4S. We welcome you to the proceedings.
Thanks, Wes, and really thanks, Wes. It's been an amazing 2 years of working with you and experiencing your gentleness and ability to bring things together. And don't run away. I'm going to say it anyway. Thank you, Wes. I think we all We're going to start with a kind of ritual moment that we don't know how to do yet very well. This year we've lost 3 really important members of our community, and I've mourned the fact that in academia we live together, we're almost family, or sometimes we really are family. We don't have good rituals for this, but this is what we can do now. Hopefully we'll grow in this. I'll introduce to you now Sal Restivo, who will be remembering Bernard Barber and Mary Douglas.
If this is going to be a way to start doing this ritual the right way, I'd like it to be celebratory. Bernard Barber, 1918 to 2006. Mary Douglas, 1921 to 2007. I had the privilege as Forest President in 1994 and 1995 to present to Bernard and to Mary their Bernal Prizes back to back. I'm honored here tonight to speak and to celebrate the memory of 2 of our own.
Is it? Okay.
Hello. Oh. Okay. Yay, Sal. Okay. Let's see if I need 2 hands now. I'm honored tonight to speak to the memory of 2 of our own. Bernard Barber, president of our society in 1980 and 1981, and the Bernal Prize recipient in 1994, and Mary Douglas, who received the Bernal Prize in 1995. It was my privilege, etc. Bernard Barber, working in the tradition and the shadows of his friends and teachers, Pudurum Sorokin, Talcott Parsons, and Robert Merton, held a unique position among the founders of the sociology of science. He was the premier student of science and ethics. His pioneering book on science and the social order, published in 1952, set agendas for the study of science and its relationships to education, defense, warfare, government, industry, and power. Merton himself identified the special distinction of this book as putting into provisional order for the first time the accumulated materials on science and society. He credited Barber with providing the first systematic overview of the sociology of science. From its earliest stages, his work reflected a greater sustained sensitivity than is evident among most of his peers to what J.D. Bernal understood as the social functions of science. His work has arguably had a greater impact on research ethics and policies in this country, in the United States, than has that of any other sociologist of science of his generation. None of his peers took as seriously as he did issues of ethics, values, power, and women in science. Few winners of the Bernal Prize had such a clear claim to an award named in honor of John Desmond Bernal. Nearly 4 decades later, in 1990, Barber published Social Studies of Science. This collection includes such classics as The Case of the Floppy-Eared Rabbits, co-authored with Rennie Fox, and Resistance by Scientists to Scientific Discovery. Both articles still well worth your reading, whether you're new to the field or an old-timer. The collection demonstrated how Barber, to a greater degree than any of his colleagues, anticipated the science studies era. He did not anticipate, nor did he ever fully embrace, the idea that scientific knowledge is socially constructed in the strong sense some of us adhere to. Here he was at one with Kuhn, Merton, and others in our pantheon of founders and Bernal Prize awardees, all of whom were understandably, if mistakenly, troubled by the red herring association of social constructionism with relativism. Bernard was there at the beginning of the sociology of science and was there again at the beginning of the science studies era. I can still see him and hear him standing at the back of a room, listening to one of us give a paper and nodding his head. Yes, yes, he whispered, we knew that. We had that. We knew that, we had that. We discovered that. He stands without peer as a link between the Mertonian generation and the science studies generation as a mentor, teacher, leader, and contributor. It was a singular honor for me when I met Bernard, whose work I had read in graduate school, became a friend, and benefited on many occasions from his support as I moved through my career. It wasn't the support that was always there, because if he thought I was doing something wasn't quite right or he didn't really like, the support was gone. But it was there for the most part. I didn't study with Barber, but he was one of those I've come to call my virtual teachers. And I did, after all, turn out to be a bit of a barbarian in the end. Speaking of virtual teachers, I first used that term at a dinner I arranged at the University of London in 1996 to honor Mary Douglas by presenting her with the Bernal Prize. She had been unable or unwilling to travel to the Forest venue. I'm laughing, those of you who know her might know why she might not have wanted to come. By presenting her with the Bernal Prize. She had, Mary loved the concept of a virtual teacher, modest the concept as it was. Like Barber, she was an incredibly generous and thoughtful scholar in person, and equally dangerous in the face of smaller minds. She knew at that point of my emerging interest in the sociology of brain and mind, and took it upon herself to invite to the dinner Bob Turner, a neuroscientist who happened to be the son of the anthropologist Victor Turner, and also a student of Mary's anthropological theories. She thought correctly that he would appreciate my efforts better than most neuroscientists. But just to keep things balanced, she invited a couple of brain scanners who were totally baffled by my conjectures and my conversations with Turner. Then, at the end of this dinner, she became obsessed with showing us the head of Jeremy Bentham. I mean, obsessed. She was running around trying to find a porter who could open the cabinet with Jeremy's head. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go look it up on the internet. But it was hilarious. We never did find the porter, and so I never did see Jeremy's head. Mary's work was a foundation and provocation for some of the earliest programmatic statements on the nature and goals of the new sociology of science, or the science studies movement, notably in the works of David Bloor. The Sunday Times survey of makers of the 20th century listed Purity and Danger and Natural Symbols among the 100 most influential nonfiction works since 1945. She was one of 4 women and one of 4 anthropologists who made that list. In his Bernal citation for Mary, Steve Shapin noted that, and I quote Steve, "She never advertised herself as a student of the natural sciences, yet she has done much to make our work possible." End of quote. She understood and encouraged our efforts to demonstrate the possibility of a radically sociological approach to scientific knowledge. Both Bernard and Mary enjoyed special relationships with their life partners. Eleanor Barber, who had studied with Bob Merton, died in 1999. James Douglas died in 2004. And it's hard to explain what those losses meant to those two people. Barber and Douglas were different in many ways, but they shared an important view of the place of the social sciences in modern civilization. Barber concluded his book on science and the social order by pointing out that Alfred North Whitehead suggested that the conception of an order of nature did not take hold and become widespread in the West until the 17th century. This idea, and these are Barber's words, this idea had a fructifying influence on the development of natural science. What then about the possibility, he thought, that the conception of an order of human nature might take place in our own time? Could we then look forward to a similarly fructifying influence on the development of the social sciences, and they're coming to have a more central place in our social, political, and intellectual lives? Douglas echoed this idea in the closing paragraphs of How Institutions Think. I'm tempted to ask you to stop using Kuhn and start using that book, but whatever. Or Fleck. Sorry, I had a little editorial comment.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. At the end of her brilliant exposition on and defense of the Durkheim-Fleck program, she wrote this: "For better or worse, individuals really do share their thoughts, and they do to some extent harmonize their preferences, and they have no other way to make the big decisions except within the scope of institutions they build." More than any social scientist since Durkheim, Mary Douglas moved the agenda of an order of human nature closer toward the center of our intellectual and civilizational landscapes. Now, those of you who know me, I'm not much for moments of silence. We should make a lot of noise, and you make a lot of noise so the dead don't come back. You want to make sure that they stay dead. So I offer, instead of a moment of silence, to the memory of these dear friends and virtual teachers, the following. They told me, Heraclitus, the poet William Johnson Corey wrote, "They told me you were dead. They brought me bitter tears, bitter news to hear, and bitter tears to shed. I wept as I remembered how often you and I had tired the sun with talking and sent him down the sky. And now that thou art lying, my dear old carrion guest, a handful of gray ashes, long, long ago at rest, still are thy pleasant voices, thy nightingales, awake. For death, he taketh all away, but these he cannot take." And finally, Longfellow, who wrote, "Let us then be up and doing, with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait." Thank you. No applause, please, for any of this.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to be speaking for a moment about another one of our own. And I wish I could use my body more to speak of this, as we've had that lively conversation in the last couple of days. When I think of Peter Wally not being there anymore, I feel like a part of my hand is cut off. Like I would reach out and Peter would be there. He was there to talk to me about hiring one of my students, Emily Ignacio, who wrote one of the first books about Filipina and Filipino identity on the web. Wonderful piece of work. And Peter was so generous in understanding all those mixed up things. This is about 10 years ago. Just there. And there again, when I asked him to do things for us, or when he volunteered or asked me. Just a wonderful person. I asked Ann Figured, who'd worked closely with him for many, many years at Loyola University in Chicago, to send me some thoughts, and these are hers.
Peter Wally of Loyola University Chicago passed away August 16th, shortly after suffering a massive stroke. Peter had been fighting a recurrence of cancer, but his sudden death in this way was a complete surprise and shock, as indeed it was for me. He received his undergraduate degree from Oxford and his master's in urban planning and sociology, and a doctorate in sociology from Columbia. Peter came from a working-class background in England. The difference between the blue-collar and white-collar world and the impact of changing technological and economic forces on these groups remained a major interest throughout his academic career, and I can say also on his collegial career and the way he thought about things. His publications on technical workers in the Western class structure are widely known and well regarded, contributions to the study of work and social change and technology. In his later work, he explored the conflicts raised as workers attempt to balance work and family life. We're not there yet, I know that, but I thank Peter for helping us think about it in new and deep ways. To return to Anne's words, his last book, Putting Work in Its Place, co-authored with Peter Meiskens, studied how part-time technical and scientific workers had customized their work schedules to combine gratifying paid employment with family life and other activities. Surely one of the most urgent intellectual problems facing us all as we study technology and its impacts. Peter taught at Loyola for 28 years. He was a mainstay of the sociology department and a contributor to the life of the university and to 4S. He was a dear friend to his many colleagues and a person of great integrity and good sense. If you have condolences or want to pass those on to his family, send them to the sociology department at Loyola. And we'll miss you, Peter. I think like Sal, I can't do a moment of silence now, but perhaps we could all think about our hands and how the people that we work with help us move and think and be in our bodies. I have also some pleasure to share with you, which is, first of all, to thank the most heroic and visible work that I know about, which is being program chair of 4S. And it's hard to even know how to thank this amount and level of invisible work. David Hess has been extraordinary this year in working under very constrained circumstances that we're all trying to deal with, especially the growth, unexpected growth of STS and 4S. And he's been more than a pleasure to work with. I just want to give him a lot of thanks and acknowledgement for what he's done.
Thank you, Lee. I really appreciate that. I want to thank all of you for helping make this happen and putting up with the difficulties of having another program with squeezed time. We've, I think, solved a lot of the glitches for next year, so it's going to be even better than this year. There are a lot of people I want to thank, so if you could just hold your applause till the end, I'd appreciate it. Number one, the graduate student assistants. Could you maybe stand up as I read your names? You'll begin to see that I didn't do anything as I go through all of these, because I think by the end of this, almost everyone in the room will be standing. But Aaron Daly, Soon-Yoon Kim, Dominic Glover, Krista Sigurdsson, Meryl Norman, Nikki Vermeulen, Martin Lappé, Michelle Stewart. They couldn't afford to come to the banquet. Oh, that's too bad. All right. Andy's here. Andy Carbonen. There you are. Okay. Logan Williams, Shalaja Valdia, Jennifer Barton, Brandon Costello-Kuhn, Anna Lampro, Gareth Adel, Heidi Gauchi, Matt Harsh, Shabnan Vazy, Bonnie Green, Christine Holmes, Paige Miller, Chris Courtwright. So we had 22 graduate students helping make the whole event happen. And that's one piece of it. I want to just mention some of the others. Number one, Lee Starr for putting together the program theme and the plenary, and also for chairing the Access Committee, which included Stephen Emery, Florence Millerand, Ursula Naue, Kristen Snodden, and Ernst Thuftenhoeft. I don't know if I quite pronounced that right. Ann Borrero, who did the secretarial work and really helped me a lot. Tracy McKee, Kathy Smith, and Libby McCurley, who handled arrangements and registration. Rick Duke, who did the catering and other arrangements. Steve Coffey, who handled the webmaster, and I could just pass off all of your problems onto Steve, and he really answered them quickly. Jean-François Blanchette, who translated the French titles in the program for me. Wenda Bouchspies, last year's program chair, who answered a lot of questions for me, was always patient, and has booked or set up the next 3 programs, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. So she's done a marvelous job of getting us all set up for the next 3 years. And the program committee, Dean Newsma, Jill Fisher, Torin Monahan, Sergio Sismondo, and Rolly Varma, who collectively read probably 300 to 400 individual papers and put them into panels, at least preliminary panels for me. So they did more work than I did, really. So let's have them stand up, the program committee and others. Okay? Now, did I forget anyone? I don't think so. Okay, let me just mention and have the next year's program chairs stand up. 2008 will be in August in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. 10, Zuderent Jarak, and Roland Ball. Is 10 here? Just so you know who he is. 2009 will be in October in Washington, D.C., Crystal City. Barbara Allen and Daniel Breslau from Virginia Tech will organize it. And 2010 will be at the University of Tokyo in August, and Yuko Fujigaki will organize that. Are you here? She's here, Yuko? All right. So thanks to all of them. We will have 30-minute sessions, we believe, next year. We will have the email addresses of all of you, so you'll have much better contact than I did. It will not be a PowerPointless conference, and it will not be a powerless, pointless conference either, I hope. The new registration system will have worked out all of its glitches, and everything will flow smoothly. So last but not least, there's one person I want to thank. Where is he? Wes.
He's right there, skulking.
Where?
Right
He's
there.
right. Oh, there he is. I don't think most of you who have been in the association for a while know what Wes does. He's sort of like Atlas holding up the world of 4S. Wes answered questions all the time, just gave me the coaching I needed, and he's really just behind many, many things in this association, making it work. So we have this incredible resource with Wes Schrum, and if anyone deserves a round of applause, it is Wes. So thank you, Wes.
Thank you, David. Indeed, I echo again that last sentiment. And thanks to all of you who helped with such generous time when there is no time. I'd like to thank the outgoing members of council who have done an incredible range of tasks this year. That is Sergio Sismondo, Joe Dumit, and Rolly Varma, who, among other things, read dozens of books for the Fleck and Carson prizes, which you will be hearing sort of retrospectively and prospectively a bit about tonight. It's a tremendous amount of work, and I really thank you for that and many other tasks that you've done. And I welcome new council members for 2008 to 2011. Andrew Lakoff, maybe you could stand so people could know you. Andrew Lakoff, Catherine Waldby, and Daniel Kleinman. It's great new additions to our council. And now I'd like to introduce Joe Dumit from University of California at Davis, who will be making nice things to say about our wonderful NHV outgoing editor and other things.
Thanks. I speak as the chair of the Publications Committee. The Society for the Social Studies of Science is very pleased to recognize the extraordinary service that Ulrika Felt has dedicated to all of us by editing Science, Technology, and Human Values for 5 years. On the heels of her successful running of the Vienna 4S East Conference, she apparently wanted to keep working continuously. During this time, she read 450 papers, 1,300 reviews with good cheer and a careful eye. This is not an easy job, as any of you who have edited know. One is often between perhaps an overeager author and the rewrite required to make a paper publishable.